The confession happened on a Sunday, in front of the whole church, and by that same evening my husband believed he had earned something back. Not my forgiveness. He already assumed he had that, something else. Something nobody ever warned me a confession could quietly unlock. I was 20 years old, standing at the stove with my back to him, and I heard the chair scrape across the floorboards behind me. And I understood before he said a single word what he thought the night was going to be. Because in my community, when a man kneels before the church and confesses, and the bishop lifts the ban, he does not just walk out clean, he walks out restored. And restoration, I would learn that night, with my hands shaking over the stove, was not only something between him and God. Before I go any further, I'm Martha, and this is Hannah the Amish girl, the channel where I share the things my community spent my whole life teaching me never to say out loud. I grew up old order Amish, and I left a few years ago, and everything I tell you here is what plain life actually looks like from the inside of it, not the postcard version the tour buses drive past. If you value hearing the truths that live behind the prayer cap, from someone who actually lived them, subscribe and tap the like button, and in the comments tell me one thing. Before today, did you even know the Amish confess their sins out loud, in front of everyone they know? I read every comment, and I am curious what brought you here. Let me explain what you just heard because I know it sounds like something out of another century, and in many ways it is. In the Amish world, sin is not private. That is the first thing outsiders never understand about us. When you break the Ordnung, the unwritten but iron code that governs every single hour of our lives, you do not simply pray about it quietly and move on with your mourning. If the offense is serious enough, and the church decides which offenses are serious, you confess it publicly. You kneel down on the bare wooden floor in front of the entire church district, sometimes 100 people, sometimes 150, your neighbors, your cousins, your own parents, and you say what you did out loud, and you ask the members to forgive you and have patience with you. Then you are sent out of the room while the church votes on whether to lift the ban. That is called being in the ban, and living under it is a kind of social death. No one eats at the same table as you, no one takes anything from your hand. Your own wife is expected to keep herself separate from you, to not share your bed, to treat you as set apart until the church says otherwise. You become a member of nothing, so when the ban is finally lifted, the relief is enormous. It is like watching someone come up out of cold water and take the first full breath. And here is the piece nobody ever says out loud, the piece I did not understand until it was my own kitchen, my own husband, my own lamp burning low on a Sunday night. When a man is restored, the community treats him as whole again the very instant the vote passes. Whole. Complete. Every right and every place he held before, handed back in a single afternoon, as if the sin had been lifted clean off him like a coat. And in a marriage, one of those rights, the way it was quietly understood in my district, without anyone ever needing to say it in plain words, was the wife, was me. I need you to sit with the timing of that. Not a week of rebuilding, not a single honest conversation, not one question asked of the woman about how she was doing. The same afternoon, the same evening, in my case, very nearly the same hour. My husband's name was Amish. I married him when I was 18, after a courtship that lasted less than half a year, the way nearly all of them do in a plain community. He was not a cruel man, and I want to be careful here because the easy version of this story turns him into a villain, and the true version is harder and sadder than that. Amish had confessed to something that had put a cold distance between us for weeks before that Sunday. I had been carrying that distance like a stone in my apron pocket. I had not decided anything about how I felt. I was still somewhere in the middle of it, still hurt, still turning it over, still working my way towards something I did not have a name for. But Amish had knelt. Amish had been forgiven by the church, publicly, completely, in front of God and everyone we knew. And in his understanding, and in the understanding of every man who had raised him, forgiveness by the church was the end of the matter. The books were closed, the account was settled. There was nothing left to work through because all of it had been done publicly, on his knees, on that hard wooden floor. What was left to him was simply to come home and let life return to its channel. And returning to normal, in a marriage, meant the marriage bed. I remember standing at that stove, the wood smoke smell in the whole house, the kerosene lamp already lit because the evenings come on early in the fall, and feeling something I could not have explained to you at the time and can only put into words now, years later, with the vocabulary a therapist eventually placed into my hands. I felt as though my own timeline simply did not exist, as though the only clock that mattered in that house was the church's. And the church had said the time had come, and so it had come, and whatever I felt about it was not a factor anyone had thought to weigh. Nobody had ever told me that my forgiveness might be a separate thing from the church's forgiveness. Nobody had ever told me I was allowed to still be somewhere in the middle of my own heart when everyone else in the world had already decided the matter was closed. There is a part of this story I cannot tell you here. Not on this platform, not under these rules. The algorithm has limits, and I have learned exactly where they are. So I wrote the rest down instead, slowly, without the softening, without the cuts. Everything the camera is not permitted to show. The book is called The Ordnung They Never Wrote Down. 208 pages of what plain life looks like from the inside of it. The link is in the first comment of this video. That is where the part I could not say out loud lives. Now let me tell you what I did not know back then, because this is the thing that changes the entire shape of the story. I thought it was only me. That is what the silence does, and it does it perfectly. It convinces every single woman that she is the only one, that whatever unease she carries in her chest is her own private failure of faith, her own weakness, her own crack the light of God has not yet reached. I thought I was a poor wife for not feeling restored in the same instant the church did. I thought a better woman, a more faithful woman, would have felt the ban lift off the marriage the very same way it lifted off her husband, cleanly, completely in one Sunday afternoon, with no ache left behind. It was years before I understood that almost every single woman I grew up around had stood at her own stove, on some evening exactly like mine, feeling exactly what I felt, and had said nothing about it to a living soul. There was a woman named Rebecca, older than me, gray already at the temples, who I helped one autumn at a canning frolic. We were down alone in the cellar with the jars and the steam, and something in how tired I must have looked made her stop her hands. She said, without once looking up from the lids she was tightening, that a woman's heart keeps its own calendar. That was all. Just that one sentence, spoken sideways, the way every real and forbidden thing was ever spoken in my community, disguised as nothing, folded into the ordinary work of the afternoon. A woman's heart keeps its own calendar. I did not understand it that day. I understood it completely the night Amos's chair scraped across our kitchen floor, and there was my friend Sarah, married 2 years before I was, who told me once in her pantry while we kneaded bread, our voices low so the men in the front room would not catch a word of it, that after her own husband's confession she had lain awake the entire night beside him, feeling like a stranger inside her own body, and had never told a single person, because who was there to tell? Her mother would have said, "Be thankful he confessed at all." The bishop would have said, "The matter is settled, go in peace." The Ordnung had no words for the space between what the church had decided and what a woman's heart was still quietly working through. So that space simply did not officially exist. And a thing that does not officially exist is a thing you carry entirely alone, in the dark, convinced you are the only one carrying it. This is the machinery I want you to see clearly, and it is built out of 3 pieces, and not one of those 3 pieces has anything to do with a woman. The first piece is that confession restores the man completely and instantly, with nothing in between. There is no partial state available to him. He is either under the ban or he is whole. There is no category in all our theology for a man forgiven by the church, but not yet forgiven by his own wife. Because in the world I was raised in, those were never imagined as two separate forgivenesses. They were one single thing. The church spoke for God, and a wife was simply part of the household the church had just restored, folded back in, along with his good name and his seat at the table. Her own separate feeling was not accounted for, because on paper it was not supposed to be separate. She was not a party to the forgiveness. She was part of what was being handed back. The second piece is that a woman's inner life was never given any standing at all. I was taught from the time I could walk to yield. I was taught that a wife submits and a husband leads, and that this was not a burden but a beautiful and natural order, the very shape God had built into a godly household. And inside that order, the idea that I might need my own time, my own slow process, my own careful walk back toward a man who had hurt me, that idea had nowhere to live. It was not forbidden exactly. It was something worse. It was simply unimagined. And you cannot ask for a thing no one has ever told you exists. You do not even know the shape of the words. The third piece is the silence, and the silence is the one that did the real and lasting damage. Because if even one woman, just one, had told me before my wedding that the church's clock and my own heart's clock were two entirely different clocks, that being restored to the community and being ready again in my own marriage were not the same event and did not have to arrive on the same afternoon, then I would have had something to stand on the night that chair scraped behind me. I would have had a single word for what I was feeling. Instead, I had only shame and confusion and the settled certainty that whatever was wrong inside of me. Now let me tell you about the night itself, as much of it as I am able to tell you here. Amos was gentle in his own way. That is the part that took me the longest to make my peace with. He did not raise his voice. He did not force anything with his hands. What he did was simpler, and, I think now, in some ways harder to forgive because it was so quiet. He assumed. He came to me that evening with the full, calm confidence of a man who believed the matter was entirely closed, because for him it truly was. He had done the single hardest thing his world ever asks of a man. He had knelt in front of everyone he knew and confessed. And now he was home, and the lamp was lit, and the children were asleep, and in his mind the whole natural order of the household was simply flowing back into its old channel, the way water always does the moment you lift the stone out of the stream. And I said nothing. That is the confession folded inside my confession, the one I never knelt for. I did not tell him I was still somewhere in the middle. I did not tell him my heart was keeping a different calendar than the church's. I said nothing at all, because I had been taught every day of my 20 years that saying nothing was the very same thing as being faithful, that a good and godly wife did not lay her own tangled feelings on top of everything else her husband already carried. So I let the evening quietly become the thing he already believed it was. And afterward I lay awake in the dark a long time, listening to the horses shift and stamp in the barn, and I felt further from that man than I had in all the weeks he was still under the ban. I did not feel restored that night. I felt overruled by a clock I had never once agreed to wind. It took me a long time, and a great deal of therapy after I finally left, to understand that what happened in that room was not a failure of my faith, and was not a crack inside me. It was the predictable result of a system that had decided, generations before I was born, that a woman's readiness was simply not a variable worth tracking, that her yes and her not yet were the same thing, and neither one needed asking for. My therapist said something once that I have turned over in my mind nearly every day since. She said that control does not always look like force. Sometimes it looks like a timeline you were never permitted to set for yourself. Sometimes the thing that quietly overrides a woman is not a raised hand at all, but a calendar hanging on the wall that everyone in her whole world agreed to, except her, and no one ever thought to ask. And I want to be fair, because fairness is the only thing that keeps a story like this one true. Amos was not a monster. He was a man who had been handed a heavy set of rules when he was still a boy, and told in the plainest terms that those rules were the direct will of God, and he followed them the very best he knew how, exactly as faithfully as I followed mine. Neither of us was ever given the words for anything else. We were two people raised inside the very same silence, and that silence stood in the bed between us like a wooden board neither one of us had ever been taught how to move, or even that it could be moved at all. There was another woman, too, I think of when I tell this. Her name was Anna, a cousin by marriage, older, quieter, who had lost most of her softness somewhere along the years. When I was young, I thought she was simply a cold woman. It was only after my own Sunday night that I understood what I had been looking at. I had been looking at a woman who had stood at her own stove many more times than I had, and who had run out of the middle of her own heart entirely. Because a heart that is overruled often enough simply stops keeping its own calendar at all. It is easier that way. It hurts less. And that is the real cost of the silence. Not one bad night. A slow forgetting that your own timeline ever existed. Eventually, years later, near the very end of our marriage, I finally found the words. I told him, at the kitchen table, the lamp burning low between us, in the same kitchen with the same lamp where the chair had once scraped. I told him that his confession had never automatically been my confession, that the church's forgiveness had never automatically been mine to give in the same afternoon, that I had needed time he never knew to offer me because no one had ever once told either of us that time was a thing a woman was even allowed to need. He was quiet for a long, long while. And then he asked me the one question that still sits in the middle of my chest to this day. He said, "Martha, why did you never tell me?" And I said, "Because I did not know that I was permitted to." We sat there a long time after that, the clock ticking on the wall, the horses shifting out in the barn, his slow breathing across the table, the lamp throwing our two long shadows up the kitchen wall. It was the most honest half-hour of our entire marriage, and it came years too late, and it came at all only because I had finally begun to imagine that my own heart might have a standing the Ordnung had never once thought to give it. When I left, the cost came fast, the way it always does. The shunning, complete and immediate. The letters I wrote home returned unopened, in my mother's own handwriting on the front. Her silence on the telephone the one time I tried to call. The door of the house I grew up in, closed to me for good. I do not tell you that for your pity. I tell you so you understand this was not a small thing I walked away from. It was every single person I had ever loved. And I still walked, because I had finally learned that a life in which my own timeline did not exist was not a life I could keep living, no matter how deep the community, no matter how warm the quilts my aunts had stitched, no matter how faithfully every last one of them showed up for every frolic and every funeral, because here is the truth I carried out of that world with me, the one the Ordnung never wrote down anywhere. The Amish world gave me real and good things, and I will never pretend it did not. It gave me a work ethic that has carried me through every hard year since I left. It gave me a community so close it had a texture you could almost hold in your two hands. It gave me faith, complicated and wounded and rebuilt from the ground up, but real, still real. But there is no scripture anywhere that makes a woman's heart run on another person's clock. There is no theology on this earth that turns a public forgiveness into a private obligation the very same hour it is granted. And there is no God that I believe in now who would build a woman with her own inner calendar and then turn around and command her to pretend, for the rest of her life, that it was never there at all. If you grew up in a world where the exact moment everyone else decided it was over was the moment you were required to feel it was over too, I see you. If you ever stood at your own stove and heard a chair scrape behind you, and felt your own timeline simply vanish out from under your feet, I see you too. You were not weak for keeping a different calendar than the one they handed you. You were not faithless for needing time no one ever offered. You were a whole person all along whose wholeness the rules were simply never designed to count, and that was their failure, and it was never once yours. If you want to read the version of this story that YouTube will not allow, the full pages are in the Ordnung They Never Wrote Down, first comment of this video. And that is everything. Choose your freedoms wisely. They might just save your life.